Here we are. Let me just stop sharing screen. And here we are live. Yay. Hello, everyone. I'm Sil Curiati, your host and storyteller, I like to say. Those who know me can attest to my passion for building bridges that connect people to people, people to jobs, brands to consumers, and even soulmates every now and then. And today I'm hosting the 6th of the meetup series, What is Your Story? I always try to bring guests who truly inspire me, hoping they will inspire you as well. This is a very different meeting. It's my first time live on YouTube. I've been live on the Neighbor platform and it was pretty easy. Now this one is a bit more complicated. There is a dashboard that looks like a navigation machine right in front of me. So sometimes I'm gonna look down and I'm gonna control it, and bear with me if there are any technical problems, hopefully not, but hopefully the flight is gonna be smooth. So I'm really happy today because I believe the stories we tell ourselves and the way we think about ourselves shape up our lives. And because I like to spread the word on that, I invited Simone Stolzoff to speak with us today. I first came across Simone when I was scrolling through Instagram, the Neighbor platform, and I saw a post by one of my favorite profiles, Upworthy. They were talking about about something that he shared about a tattoo, the only tattoo he has that was done 10 years ago by a 96-year-old woman then in Philippines. Turns out this woman is Apo-Whang-Od, and I'm not sure if I pronounced her name correctly. So if anyone knows, please correct me, and probably Simone knows. So he's going to be able to correct me. But she happened to be the oldest ever Vogue cover model at age 106, about a month ago. She's wonderful, and I just love this story for so many reasons. I love tattoos. I love tattoo artists. I love the idea of having a 106-year-old woman as a cover of a magazine. Representation is everything. Plus, I like to debunk the myth of having old people not working with tools and stuff. So this is a very cool story for him to tell us. And then I reached out to Simone. He kindly answered to my request to speak. Plus, he happened to have just written a book that's about to come out, to be launched, The Good Enough Job. And the book is everything that I believe we should consider life and work-life balance, and how our identities should not be shaped up by our work, and so on and so forth. So enough about me, and to talk about tattoos, work, life, and everything else, it's my honor to introduce Simone Stolzoff. Welcome, Simone.
Thank you, Sil. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm super excited to have you. Did I pronounce her name correctly?
Apo-Whang-Od? Yeah, I think so. I don't speak Tagalog myself, but I think you did a pretty good job.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. All right, Simone, just to kick off our conversation, and hopefully we're going to have some questions coming up too, but I do have a lot of questions. I read your book and I thought it was incredible. I'm not going to introduce you traditionally and give you your bio, give everyone your bio, because you are here, so you can tell about yourself. What is your story?
Yeah, it's a big question. And I think part of the book is really exploring how we answer that question. You know, in the US, you might start with your career and really think that you are what you do. And part of my mission with the book is to help people think differently about their identities, to really consider the multifacetedness of who each of us are. But short story is, my name is Simone. I'm Italian American. I live in San Francisco, and I'm a journalist and an author. This is my first book. It's very exciting. It comes out in about 10 days from today. Woo! And my background is a bit of a meandering path. And so in college, I studied poetry and economics. And as you might expect, that set up some kind of tension between kind of the world of art and the world of commerce in my life. And I spent my 20s really looking for like a vocational soulmate, for a job that could help me self-actualize. And so I worked in tech for a few years, and I worked in food, and I worked in design, and I worked in journalism, all the while looking for that dream job. And it all came to a head at a particular crossroads in my career. I was about 28 years old. I was working as a magazine reporter for this trendy New York-based media company, and I had a recruiter reach out to me for a job offer at this company called IDEO, which is this global innovation and design firm. And always take the interview, take a call, and I kind of went through the job process relatively passively. And then at the end, I was at this crossroads, at this fork where I was deciding between continuing this path of journalism and writing and reporting, or joining this kind of new shiny company. And it really sent me for an existential loop. On one hand, it's like, oh, woe is me, the agony of having to decide between two attractive job offers. But on the other hand, it really felt like I wasn't deciding between two jobs. I was deciding between two versions of myself.
Mm.
And I think that sort of fork in the road was really the seminal moment that sent me on this quest of we're trying to figure out how work has become so central to our identities, and whether that is actually an approach that is fulfilling us in both our work and our lives outside of it. And so, yeah, I ended up taking the design job, and the last few years I've been working on this book called The Good Enough Job, and I'm excited to be here with you to talk about it.
You've done so many things, like for someone talking about work and how it should not become our identity. You've done so many things. It feels like a bit of an experimentation, like trying to, as you said, it's not about two different jobs, it's two different versions of myself. Did you feel as if you were a completely different person in one job and then as opposed to the other, like even with economics and poetry, like these two things, how does that feel to you? How are the contradictions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably relatable. We all are more than just one thing. We all have many interests beyond just what we do for work. And for a long time, I was under the impression that I could find a job that scratched my every itch, that was a perfect continuation of my unique personality and a means of creative expression. And I think a lot of people take that approach, and rightfully so. We work more than we do just about anything else, and how we spend those hours matters. But I think the risk is that when we live a work-centric existence, when our job is sort of the central axis around which the rest of our life orbits, it can crowd out other parts of who we are. We're more than just workers. We are also neighbors and siblings and parents and citizens and friends. And I think one of the main risks of really over-identifying with what you do for work is that your job might not always be there. It's something that so many people have found out during the pandemic in the last few years. If your job is your sole source of identity and meaning and purpose and community, and then you lose that job, often by no fault of your own, what's left?
Yep.
And so that's sort of the argument that I make in the book about the value of diversifying our identities, the value of diversifying the sources of meaning and fulfillment in our life beyond our work, not only to, hedge against the risk of losing your job, but also because it makes us into fuller versions of ourselves.
I 100% agree with you. Intuitively, I've done this in my life, not about job, but I'm one of those people who has a lot of interests in so many different things, and it feels like I'm pursuing each one of them, and I try to learn, and then I dance, and then I paint, and then I do this and that, and I experiment with so many things, and they make me happy, and it's more fluid, and it feels like they build me, they build who I am today. So when I talk to people about bringing their whole selves to work, and I know this is a very dangerous thing to talk, especially when we're talking about diversity, inclusion, like not everyone feels comfortable in bringing their whole selves to work, but it's more about their interests. It's more about these different personas that you just described, like being a neighbor, a sibling, a partner, a father, a son, whoever you are. And all the interests you have. I think it brings all, by bringing it all, you bring all the creativity, you bring all the connections, and you're probably become even a better problem solver, I would say.
Yeah, and the research backs this up. It shows that people with greater, what they call self aspects or more self complexity, tend to be, for example, more resilient in the face of adversity. So you can imagine, if you are rising and falling solely with your professional accomplishments and your self-worth is tethered to your work, and your boss says something disparaging in a meeting, that can spill over to all other facets of your life. But if you have more of a diversified sense of who you are, maybe you can be more resilient and bounce back. There's also research that shows that people that have many interests and hobbies and do activities outside of work tend to be more creative and better workers as well. And so, I'm wary to just make the case that cultivating different sides of ourselves makes us better workers. But it's true, it's analogous to the conversation about rest. And a lot of times people make the case for resting or for leisure because it allows you to recharge and kind of get back on the clock. But there's also an end in and of itself when we are able to spend more of our time doing things other than work, where we can grow in ways that maybe aren't monetizable or aren't necessarily quantifiable, but actually aid us in being the kind of people that we want to be.
Yeah, grow more synapses and everything. So, well, as I said, I read The Good Enough Job, and I was hooked from the beginning, from the introduction, a real great introduction, by the way. And I have a question to you. Writing The Good Enough Job was a good enough job for you? Tell us about the process of writing the book. You said for the past 5 years, you've been working on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think there's like a very central irony in the book, which is I started writing it alongside a full-time job. As I mentioned, I took that job at IDEO, and for the first year or so working on the book, I was doing it on nights and weekends and trying to find little pockets of time here and there. And then over time, I took a book leave to work on it full time, and eventually ended up leaving my job. But I think there's something very interesting about my own process of navigating it. I'm writing this book about the culture of overwork in the United States, and I saw a lot of the tendencies that I was writing about in myself. I think there were weeks where I would feel great after I hit my writing goal and feel like I was a unworthy person on weeks that I didn't get as much done as I wanted to. And weeks where I wasn't very productive, which pushed me to work on the weekends, even though I vowed not to work on the weekends. And it's this sort of like vicious loop where I didn't get as much done, and so I'm working more, and then I'm even less productive, and then I don't have time to recharge, and it continues. And so I think, our relationship to work is an ongoing struggle. It's not this sort of fixed state of like the proverbial land of work-life balance where once you reach it, this kind of static equilibrium. I think we're constantly wrestling with what relationship we want to have with our job, whether our job feels like it's right-sized in our lives. And I was doing a lot of that work myself as I was writing it.
I can imagine. I hear you. It feels like it's a job itself. So obviously, because it is a job, but it feels like a paid job that you have to accomplish certain times and do some certain times of the day and make sure that you sit and work and produce. And sometimes it's just unbearable. I know that a lot of people who I speak with who left the corporate world and became freelancers or are opening their own companies, they say that they had imagined that they would work differently and find time to rest and block their calendars and all sorts of wellness things that we learn and we try to do, and turns out that they can't. It's really tough to manage. because you
Yeah.
want to accomplish something, and maybe it's an ego thing. I don't know.
I mean, especially now with, modern knowledge work, it's very leaky. If
Yeah.
you are in the factory working on the assembly line, you can't bring the machines back to your living room with you. But in our
Yeah.
current day and age, work is always available. It sort of exists like a gas, and it can very easily just fill all of our unoccupied space. And so the need to be more intentional about when we are and aren't working, the onus often falls on the individual to have to draw those boundaries. And
Yeah.
it can be really tricky. And especially if you work for yourself, maybe you don't need a manager cracking the whip, because we have a manager in our own minds that is telling us you are worthy if you output a certain number of things or widgets in the world. But the truth is, like, there isn't a direct relationship between how many hours you put in and the quality of your work, especially in the knowledge economy. In
Hmm.
order to produce knowledge work, often you need those spaces for ideas to be able to bounce off of each other, for you to be able to synthesize what you're taking in. And so by working all the time, you're ironically not making yourself a better worker.
That's a great point, and it actually led me to think something else. Because sometimes we're just doing our work and performing our work, and we're actually managing the time and the time frame and how we're supposed to rest and that kind of stuff. But then it turns out that with social networks and that pressure as well to promote what we do, it gets kind of overwhelming. We're doing the work, and then there is the extra hours that you have to put in to actually make sure that people are seeing that you're doing the work. Is this a thing, or did you identify this somehow happening to people? Because to me, it's really overwhelming, like WhatsApp groups and Instagram, and you have to put, so there are algorithms that you have to respect and leverage somehow to benefit from the network and this kind of things. Like, it's just so stressful.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's particularly pronounced for people who work for themselves or who are their
Yeah.
own brands or who are influencers. But I think a version of this exists in office work as well. There's this kind of presenteeism where we want to have like the little icon on Slack or Microsoft Teams be available so that it shows that you certainly must be working, And I think we see this in some of these questions about the return to the office, just the conflation of hours spent working with the quality of the work, even though they aren't always aligned. And so I think it really puts the onus on us to be able to carve out space for non-work time and to be able
Mhm.
to do things other than work. One of the benefits
Yeah.
of, say, going to a yoga class or going on a walk with a best friend is these are things that are sort of outsourced willpower. There's accountability to not be checking your email while you're doing these activities. They not only are activities that exist as an
Yeah.
end in and of themselves, the pleasure or the different side of your identity or force of meaning that you can cultivate by doing them, but they also provide structural barriers to being able to from working all the time.
Yeah. See people. Don't bring your cell phones to these walks and to these interactions. Just use them to your benefit. Um, for those who are looking forward to reading your book, can you talk more about the concept of being good enough? Because in the context of jobs, especially, because I feel like we tend to think that good enough is not the best we can. And we're more, at least as living in the US, there is this culture of you having to deliver the best you can. It's not only the good enough.
Yeah. So, the title of the book, The Good Enough Job, is an allusion to a theory that was devised by this British pediatrician named Donald Winnicott in sort of the mid 20th century.
Mhm.
And Winnicott was observing this growing idolization of parenting, where there were these parents, specifically mothers, who wanted to be perfect. They wanted to shield their kid from experiencing any sort of harm or negative emotion. And then when the kid inevitably felt frustrated or sad or angry, the parent would take it extremely personally. They would see it as a reflection of their own shortcomings. And so Winnicott proposed this idea, this theory called good enough parenting, or the good enough mother, where instead of valuing perfection as the ideal, Winnicott advocated for sufficiency. And by doing so, he believed that it would benefit both the child, who would learn how to self-soothe and take care of themselves, and the parent, who wouldn't lose themselves in their kids' emotions. And
Mhm.
so, I'm making a direct comparison to the working world, where there's
Yeah.
this growing idolization of work and dream jobs and jobs that can help you self-actualize. But, like a crying toddler, a job is not always something in your control. And so by thinking about your vision for a well-lived life, and then how your job can support that vision, as opposed to your job being sort of the central axis around which the rest of your life orbits, we're able to both develop more contentment and fulfillment in the work that we are doing, and cultivate other sides of ourselves outside of the office.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. You touched a bit of, you talked about control, and you talked a bit about the layoffs in your intro. I remember right on your third page, you wrote something that I felt so strongly about, not only for living in New York, but also for coming from São Paulo, where they actually have similar beliefs. Paulistas tend to believe that they're New Yorkers sometimes. You said, and I quote, "In the United States, how we make money is shorthand for who we are. Our livelihoods have become our lives." Do you believe that this way of living could worsen people's reactions to layoffs, for example? And you mentioned that a little bit, so I'd love for you to explore it a little bit more. And I thought of it as I read about your grandmother, especially having a very straightforward identity that cannot be lost regardless of what she was doing for a living. But this is in Italy, right? And it's a completely different culture. Although it's very similar to Brazilians in some aspects, Paulistas in particular are more similar to what Americans do here, which is unhealthy to my conception. I'd love to hear your story, like your grandmother and layoffs and identity. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I think like the inclination to want to identify with what you do for work is not necessarily a bad thing. We work
Mhm.
more than we do just about anything else. For many, it can be a source of meaning and community and purpose and identity. I think it becomes problematic, though, when it is the sole source of identity and meaning and
Mhm.
purpose in your life. I think that was really the lesson of the pandemic. Everyone's job changed to a certain extent. Obviously, some people were laid off or furloughed. Other people who really relied on the office to be their primary social hub were forced to reckon with, what is my life like when I'm not standing around the water cooler, or who am I when I'm not at the office? I do think there is a generational component to this, as you alluded to.
Mhm.
Thinking about my own family history, as I mentioned, my grandmother was first and foremost like a woman of faith, Roman Catholic, Southern Italian. She saw herself as a grandmother, as a mother, as a woman of God. And, she worked in a coffee shop. And of course, like, she even enjoyed her work. She liked it very much, but it was not who she was. And then, my parents are both psychologists. And I think they take a sort of perspective of both looking for some fulfillment from their work, but also being very clear-headed about sort of the economic contract of work, and work as a means to be able to afford the life that they want to live. For my mom to be able to buy heirloom tomatoes at the farmer's market, and to fly home to visit all of her family in Italy. And I think for me, and particularly kind of my generation, I'm sort of smack dab in the middle of the millennials. I was raised with a certain script about how I could basically do whatever I want. There was this world of possibility in front of me. And I do acknowledge that, even the question, what do you want to do, necessitates a certain level of privilege,
Mhm.
of having options. But I also think there is something uniquely cultural about this day and age, where we've seen the decline of other sorts of institutions of meaning and identity, like organized religion or like neighborhood and community groups. We've also seen a rise in sort of the celebrification of CEOs, and this culture where, always do what you love is painted on the walls of our co-working spaces. I'm reminded of that famous commencement speech from Steve Jobs, where he basically says, the only way to do great work is to love what you do. And if you haven't found work that you love, don't settle, keep searching, keep searching. And it creates these massive expectations of what a job can deliver. Our jobs were not designed to deliver transcendence. And often it's the expectations that actually create more disappointment than the reality.
That's such a good point. And it's a very Occidental way of saying things, the high expectations about work. Well, I know, and I'm not sure if I'm gonna say this correctly, but I know in Japan, they are very dedicated too. And although they are very dedicated and they look to their jobs in a similar way, there is a thing about not setting the expectations so high or as high as to the point that you can just be disappointed and frustrated. So managing this, and probably it comes with having a healthy life outside work. I'm rumbling here, but because I'm thinking of all the things that you said, I'm like, okay, maybe there is a solution. Because to your point, I mean, I've been speaking with a lot of very smart women, a group of women leaders, actually two different groups, one here in the US of international women in business, women from all over the world who live here in the US, and also a group of Brazilian women who rise and raise others, and that's our flag. And they're all very, they're high achievers, they're all passionate about their works. And oftentimes these women speak about their jobs as service. They're serving and they're giving back. And there is a thing about it's almost like a donation. And I feel that too, to a certain extent. So is this wrong in your conception? Is this wrong to see your jobs in that way? I believe your dad's, I think it's your dad that you mentioned something about him in your book, that he sees his work as service too, and he's a psychologist. So I can understand why. But there are so many other jobs, like in technology, a technology executive or a CEO of a company that's, I don't know, a goods company, a food and goods company, or a bank. Can they see their jobs as service too? Is this wrong? Is this right? What is the good and bad of seeing your job that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets at what I was talking about earlier, which is that it's not necessarily a problem to look at your job as a way of serving or a way of giving back. My dad was saying that he sees his work as a type of philanthropy. I think it is only a problem when it becomes your sole source of service or your sole source of purpose in life. Because, a job, as I mentioned, is not always something that is in your control, and if you lose that vehicle or that avenue to be able to give back, you can really go for an existential loop. The phrase identity crisis was coined by the psychologist named Erik Erikson, and it came out of this study that he did where he was looking at military veterans who were returning from war, and folks who had this real kind of identity as a soldier and a clear hierarchy of where they fit in the organization. And then they come back and then they aren't sure who they are. It sends them for an existential loop. They go through an identity crisis. And I think that is the risk of having an identity that is solely defined by what you do for work. I had this interaction with a mentor of mine when I was in college. He is a professional poet. His name is Anis Mojgani. He's actually the current poet laureate of the state of Oregon. And here I was, like a 22-year-old poetry student about to embark on an unknown future. And I said, okay, Anis, how do you feel about the phrase, do what you love and never work a day in your life? And I was expecting for him to give me sort of like a pep talk. I wanted him to say, go out there, follow your passion. And he didn't. He said, some people do what they love for work, and others do what they have to for work so they can do what they love when they're not working. And neither is more noble. And I think that that last part is key. Like
Yeah.
we live in a society that loves to revere people whose work is an act of service, or whose work neatly aligns with their personality or their identity. But he was, my idol, a professional poet, no less, telling me that it's okay to have a day job. And I think that's like a mentality that would really serve us to take some of the pressure off of our work for being our means of self-actualization,
Mhm.
and actually thinking about how we can disperse that expectation or that desire to other facets of our lives.
Mhm. I love that quote too. And I was going to ask you about this. I'm so glad that you brought this up. You also brought up some very interesting data in your book when you talked about the fact that in the last half century, the highest earners are responsible for some of the greatest increases in work time. The same Americans who can afford to work the least are working more than ever. Oh my goodness. I was like, okay, I tend to think that the most dangerous motivators ever are greed and power. And
Mm.
the only things that come to my mind when you say that this has happened is greed and power. I don't know why are these people working more and making more people working more if they don't need it?
Mm.
Aren't they giving back then, finding something else to give back instead of giving back through work? Do you have any research insight to share with us?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I love observing this trend because it sort of bucks conventional wisdom, right? Like
Mhm.
historically, the richer the country is, or the richer the individual is, the less they worked,
Yeah.
because frankly, they could afford not to. And that has been the case, for the majority of civilization. In the 1970s, the average American and the average German and the average French worker worked all about the exact same number of hours each year. And now the average American works 30% more than the average German. And, the question is why? Like, why are so many Americans trading their money for more work? And I think, there's a few ways to get into it. One is, for some people, work has gotten better. Like when work was dirty, less is more, but when work is meaningful, more is better. For some, they just don't have other sources of community or meaning and identity. And so they are choosing to work as much as they can. And then there's also sort of economic arguments. The tax structure in the United States allows the wealthiest to control and keep more of their wealth than some of our peer nations. And so there's more potential to earn as you work longer and longer hours.
Mhm.
But it really, I think, to me, asks a question about priorities and how we are choosing to spend our leisure time or our free time is, I think, a great indication of what we value. There's this Stanford Business School professor that had this great line, which was like, show me your calendar and I'll show you what you value. And, if you look at the calendars for the wealthiest Americans, you can, the proof is in the pudding.
Hmm. This is something for me to reflect on too. I remember in my corporate life, I just left my corporate life in January this year, early January, and my calendar was always so busy with one-on-one meetings. It feels like we want to build this culture of working all the time and not necessarily producing all the time. The working all the time is making sure you're busy, you're kept busy, you're meeting with people, you're talking to people, but then there is not enough room for you to actually let the connections happen. Even in our brains, it's not healthy because of this. And then you have to find time at night to work because you couldn't work during the day because you're doing meetings.
Mm,
And this is a classical, this is becoming more and more. And I don't know if it's a generational thing. I hope it is.
mm,
I always say that the new generations are entering the workforce a workforce that was actually not made for them or by them. So they have this entire blank canvas to create on, and hopefully to better. And that's what I expect, because I'm Generation X, and I come from boomers, and we're all we all think alike about work, and it's tough to just try and be more flexible and be more fluid and see try different ways of having our careers. And you mentioned something about this too that I'd love to talk about. This you mentioned that 200 years ago no one had a career, and this has changed with the Industrial Revolution, right? So we've been living now in a unique area as jobs are becoming more fluid and people are engaging with different interests now. And I do believe that this started to happen with the pandemic. I think it's probably a good thing that the pandemic left us. So I'd love to hear from you. Do you believe we can come back to this place where careers are not a thing and we can work more freely doing what we love and changing our minds more often every now and then? How good and how bad can this be?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we really zoom out, we can look at sort of the sweep of history. And, when you're in an agrarian economy, everyone is a farmer. There aren't careers, you are doing the same job as most of your neighbors, as your father and your mother and your grandfather and grandmother. And there was a natural kind of cyclical nature to work where you sort of rise and fall with the sun, and certain seasons are busier and certain seasons are more laid back. And, with the growth of electricity and the Industrial Revolution, a lot of those natural barriers of being in tune with the seasons and the sunlight changed. And, the majority of work was moved into factories, and we spent, a few hundred years working in this new industrial model. And now we're in a new economy. It's a digital age. It's an economy that's driven primarily by knowledge work. And we still have a lot of the same outdated approaches to management and the workday that are still, holdovers from that industrial age before us. I think there's a line in the book about how, things like the 40-hour work week or the 9-to-5 work day or the 2-day weekend, these seem like they were sort of like passed down to us from up on high. But in actuality, these were things that were negotiated. They're largely born out of the organized labor movements of the, late 19th century and early 20th century. And they were negotiated before, and they can be negotiated again. And I think that's sort of the moment we're in right now, where with remote work, with hybrid work, people are really returning to first principles and thinking about, okay, what is the role that work should play in my life? Like, how are we going to organize work within this company or organization? And it's exciting because we have a much more expansive definition of what work has to look like. And people are waking up to the fact that, what worked then doesn't necessarily work now.
Yeah. And when you talked about that belief that when you do what you love, you never have to work, right? And your conversation with the poet, I keep thinking about, well, there are few lucky people in the world that probably can say this. Well, I love what I work and I don't need to think about work-life balance, which is probably unhealthy. I'm kind of thinking now that loving what you do that much can be unhealthy because it leads to a non-balance. I'm just throwing this here, not sure if that's how it works. But then we think about the unlucky ones, right? The majority that these people who work just to get by. And you mentioned this, I think it's in the beginning of your book too, Hamza Taskin, one of your characters in the book. They talk about how work is something that they don't have a choice. They have to go and work and make the money and make the living, etc. So since each one of us we have one life, and then there is work, and then there is the rest of your life. What is a smart way of solving this equation if we are one of these unlucky ones that we have to actually work sometimes extra hours? In some countries, women have 2 or 3 work journeys in a day to make a living, for example. Men too, but I talk a lot about women because on top of their work, their shifts at work, they also have the work back at home. Oftentimes they are caregivers and caretakers of children or elderly, etc. So it feels like it's unbearable. It feels like it's work 24/7. Is there a way to solve the equation if you're unlucky and you do not love your job?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought this up because I think there are two separate issues that often get conflated, and they tend to align pretty closely to class. And the majority of people, both in the United States and globally, don't work to self-actualize. They work to survive. They're people like Hamza, and I think when we think about interventions that might help, a lot of those interventions rest on the shoulders of government officials, people who make policy, and on managers and bosses. I think one of the reasons why we're seeing so many hourly workers burn out is because wages have been stagnant for the last 40 years. And so people are having to work more just to earn the same loaf of bread. Particularly in a country like the United States, where your healthcare is often tied to your employment, where for immigrants, your ability to stay in this country is often tied to your employment. Part of the reason why our relationship to work is so fraught is because the consequences of losing work are so dire. That's one side of the economy. On the other side of the economy, there's white collar workers, salary workers, what I often like to think of as sort of the chattering class. And these are the people that are putting a lot of subjective value on work. These are the people who are treating work akin to a religious identity, something that doesn't just deliver a paycheck, but also, purpose and meaning and transcendence. And it requires a different intervention. I think some of it rests on the shoulders of individuals, to be able to draw better boundaries between their work and their life, to be able to understand what their definition of good enough is and knowing when to stop. There's this religious scholar that I interviewed for the book whose work I love named Casper ter Kuile. And he puts out the same tweet every week on Friday afternoons that I always admire. And he says, the work is not done, but it is time to stop. And I think for people that have the privilege to be able to dictate some of their hours and to have the flexibility in their days and their weeks to determine when the work gets done, they have to internalize that. They have to internalize that you're not going to get it all done in a day or in a week. And knowing when to stop is equally important. Just one more point on this. I have this mentor. Her name is Anne Helen Peterson. She's also a great journalist and an author. And she talks about the distinction between boundaries and guardrails. So if you think about, driving down the road, there are the boundaries, the sort of, straight lines, yellow lines that differentiate one lane from the next. And then there are the guardrails. There are the metal barriers that prevent you from going off the road. And I think often when we talk about, work-life balance or setting better boundaries, we are talking about individuals, practice self-care or draw a boundary or, take care of yourself this weekend. But the point that she makes that I agree with is that often the onus to erect the guardrails, the things that keep us from falling off the road, should lie on the shoulders of the employers. It should be up to companies to be able to make sure that they've hired enough employees to get the work done and that there's enough slack in the system so that if an employee is on vacation for a week, they shouldn't have to be checking email, or there are clear expectations set around when people are on and off the clock. And on the government to decouple our basic human needs from our employment. I'm not like a huge fan of UBI as a policy necessarily, but I think what it does is it puts a stake in the ground and says that, you know, our basic human needs are human rights, and that
Mhm.
we, when given a little, just a modicum of social support, can see the benefits for all of society. You know, I think one of the other sort of silver linings of the pandemic is we saw, with just a little bit of government support, people were able to leave jobs that were not good enough for them. And I think it's a great misconception of the Great Resignation that it was just people, you know, quitting their jobs to sit on their couch and play video games. No, like in actuality, the majority of people who quit in the last 3 years quit to find better jobs, to find
Yes.
jobs that had higher pay, that had more workplace protections and benefits. And it raised the bar for employers to
Yeah.
have to raise the minimum wage or have to give better working conditions if they wanted
Yeah.
to attract employees.
Yes. Yes. 100%. Wow. So well said. Yeah. People quit their jobs for all these things, plus all the harassment they face when they're not working the way it's expected them to work, or they're not fitting in. Not even they're not working, they're not fitting in. And the cultures have been very toxic in so many big companies. So well, I second everything that you said. Plus, I'm setting an alarm. I'm serious here. I'm setting an alarm saying the job is not done, but it's time to stop. It's forever now. I'm going to do this every day. Every day this alarm is going to ring, because it's going to set off, because I need to learn how to stop. I love that tweet. And thank you for sharing this with us. We have a few minutes left, and I want to talk about you a little bit, because the book, although there is a lot of you in the book, it's not about yourself. And you talked about purpose and talking about chasing your vocational soulmate. Tell us a little bit about this experience. Is your soulmate being a writer, or is this something else? So what did you find it?
Yeah, I mean, I think my aspirations for my own career changed a bit over the course of reporting the book. You know, at the beginning, I thought, you know, maybe I'd write the book and then I'd go back to the corporate world and try and, you know, work my way up the corporate ladder. And I think now my aspirations are really to write books. And, you know, obviously not just that, but to think about that being the North Star. And I've already started thinking about what my next book might be about. And I really fell in love with the process of reporting and writing and researching and editing. And that's sort of my own dream at this moment.
I love that you found it. There is a question that came up here, and I'm going to ask, because then I'm going to switch topics. Hi, thanks for the great insights. I'd like to know your opinion on boundaries. It seems bosses and clients think freelancers and people who are working from home must be available 24/7. And that's true. And it's harder because there is no culture for you to refer to when you're a freelancer, or, well, when you're working from home, usually there is, but there are no clear boundaries, because it's your phone and you have to give it, or messages and all that, like those things that you mentioned in the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the question. Thank you for it. My partner is an elementary school teacher, and she told me something once that has stuck with me, which is it's easier to set strict expectations from the beginning than to be chill and then expect those expectations to be honored in the end. And I think the same is true in any sort of like working or client relationship. It really starts with being clear with when you are available, what are the terms of this agreement. And I think a lot of employers and clients take advantage of freelancers for this reason. They think that, you know, because you're hiring them and they're not, you know, your W-2 employees, then you can just expect them to always be working or always be available. I also think that like freelancing can provide a model for an alternative way of doing things. So I have this friend Wudan, who is a great freelancer, and she doesn't work on Fridays, and she, you know, never has, and she makes that clear with any client that she takes on. And because she is her own boss, she can set that boundary up for herself, you know. And so for the person asking, I would advise you to just be explicit about as many terms as you want upfront. And, I think like in the book, I write a little bit about taking a more transactional approach to work, which might
Uh-huh.
sound crass, especially when we're told that jobs are meant to be callings and identities and meaning, et cetera. But, fundamentally, jobs are economic contracts. And I think when you're working for yourself or when you're freelancing, this is very apparent. And you can choose not just um, to define what you're giving, but also what are the limits to what you're able to give. And so if you can have
Yes.
a conversation and set expectations, or maybe even put it on paper up front, it'll
A
be much
contract.
easier to return to it.
Yeah, a
Exactly.
contract. I agree with you. And if I can add something, I would say that and that's for me, it's probably the best way of doing this if you're already in a relationship is working as if you're conditioning a dog. It's a conditional behavior. You
Mm,
stop answering, because if you continue to answer, they're going to be conditioned to write and to ask and to be answered, and that you're going to reply or go on the phone, etc. If you stop doing this, make it clear, it's not happening, these are my rules, and then you stop doing this, people eventually will understand that after X hour, I don't know your time limit, what it is, but let's say 6 p.m., 5 p.m., whatever you like, I'm not answering. So they stop writing to you because they're not going to receive an answer. And then they have to manage their own anxiety of expecting you to answer. So work on the conditioning side too. But
mm.
that was a great question. Thank you for asking. And so I now want to talk about this wonderful woman that you met. And I know you have a great story to talk about this too, because it has to do with you even finding yourself in the chase, in your well, the whole experience of understanding yourself too. So as I said, for those of you who were not here, when I first met Simone, it was in the context of something that's very near and dear to my heart. I raise awareness about ageism whenever I can. And last month's Vogue cover model, it was something worth celebrating. Apo-Whang-Od, a 106-year-old tattoo artist from the Philippines, was beautifully portrayed.
Mm.
And for me, it's worth celebrated, not only because of the representation of having an old woman on a fashion magazine cover, but also because she's still actively working as many other old people. Oh, can you believe these old people still work? So tell us about how you ended up meeting her and what the experience was like, because it's particularly interesting to imagine a 96-year-old woman tattooing you, and
Mm.
with the tools, it's a very particular tool that the Filipino use to tattoo, and this special art that she's a representative of. So tell us about it.
Okay, I'll tell you the full story because,
Okay.
yeah,
Yay.
it requires a little bit of context. So I was 24, 25 at the time. And I was living in Southeast Asia, and I was working as a freelance journalist. And I had spent a month in Vietnam, and then I went to Hong Kong briefly. And I was on the flight back to Vietnam, and they wouldn't let me in the country. They said, my visa had overstayed its welcome, and I had to leave. And they gave me a handwritten boarding pass and put me back on the exact same flight that I was on, back to Hong Kong. And so, my life was pretty mobile and flexible at that point. I had, the clothes on my back, and I was looking up countries where Americans could go without needing a visa. And the Philippines was on that list. And so from the Hong Kong airport, I booked a ticket to Manila, and I fly to Manila. And I was staying in Manila at this hostel, and I had a pretty open itinerary. And, the local sort of hostel owner, this Filipino man, says, you've got to go up to Kalinga. You've got to go get a tattoo from Apo-Whang-Od. And, she was this sort of like local legend and famous to a few, both in the Philippines, but also among people who collect tattoos, sort of a pilgrimage destination. And so it was quite a trek to get there. It was I remember, like a 4-hour bus ride and then a 2-hour jeepney ride, which are these sort of like open air jeeps that are communal taxi cabs. And then you have to trek, you have to walk from a trailhead to get to her village, which is a little ways away. And how it worked, it's this very kind of traditional form of tattooing where you stay in her village, she gets to know you, you get to know her a little bit, and then it's an act of faith. You maybe pick the location and for your body, and she picks the design. And traditionally in her culture, tattooing was it was an award. It was something that was bestowed upon particularly like warriors in her culture that did something in the military. And in the same sense, that it was very much like an honor to get a tattoo by her. And so, she's this, 96-year-old woman, and I picked a location on my ankle, and she picked a design that was representative of the symbol for a bird or someone who sees life with perspective. And they take a palmetto thorn and it's attached to the end of a bamboo stick and dip it into the ink at the bottom of a rice bowl, and tap tapped her legacy into my ankle. And yeah, it was an amazing experience. I mean, I think I ended up writing about it. It is kind of indicative of art forms and the different ways in which we can both honor and take advantage of people who have very particular cultural forms of art. In her culture, the art of tattooing is passed down in hereditary lines, and she had very few next of kin. So sort of one of the questions was whether she would be the last Kalinga tattoo artist, and her grandniece actually ended up taking up the craft as well and is continuing the tradition.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I think like a tattoo, it's imbued with so much more meaning because of the story of how I got it.
I know. Well, I love tattoos. I have a lot of tattoos, but none of them has this story. I have some weird stories about my tattoos. This is just amazing. And I'm curious if, and you can be honest here, at any point, did you feel insecure about having such an old woman doing such a delicate job, and that's going to be permanent on your skin?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I was naive or just like ignorant and young, but no, I mean,
I don't blame you.
I was excited about it the whole time. And, I thought that, obviously you don't get to her stature without lots of practice, and she deserves all of the respect that she got. And so I kind of surrendered and left it to fate and said, okay, this is going to be what it's going to be. And thankfully I'm, very happy with the result.
I love that. Any final thoughts? We're at time, and time flew. Actually, I wanted to open up. Let's see. Thank you so much for this inspiring, uplifting conversation. Thank you, Julie. I'm so glad that people joined, and we're happy to see you. I'm sure that everyone took something to their hearts, and they're gonna reflect on things. I'd love for you to give us your final thoughts. Plus, yes, please advertise your book. Tell where people can find it, because it's so good.
Thanks. Well, it comes out in 10 days, which is very exciting, and you can pre-order it right now. It's called The Good Enough Job: Reclaiming Life from Work. It's published by Penguin Random House, and you can learn more at thegoodenoughjob.com. And I just want to say thank you to you, Sil, for creating this platform to be able to have this conversation and to share our stories. I think there's nothing more human or important than doing what we've just done. So thanks for having me.
I'm glad. I think stories connect us, and I think you do a great job telling yours and helping people through your research and work live better lives. So thank you so much. And thanks everyone who is here. Are you going to have this book in other countries too, or it's just in the US?
Yeah, it'll be translated into several different languages. It comes out on the 23rd here in the US and the 25th in the UK. And I'm not sure about some of the other dates, but you can learn more at thegoodenoughjob.com, and that should have everything you need.
Yeah, check it out, people. And Thank you again. It's been a pleasure, and I'm gonna follow you and be connected and stay connected, because I really want to see this the huge success that's gonna be, hopefully.
Thank you so much. Well, take it easy. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Good
Bye.
enough to put it right here because it's yes, so people can see. Yes, good. Good enough job. Great.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye. And stream is finished.